Most people think wealth looks like ownership, a nice house, a new car in the driveway, maybe a few upgraded things that signal you're doing well. But here's the strange part. Some of the most expensive things people own are actually making them poorer every single month. Take a typical example. A house payment, about $2,500 per month. A car payment, about $900 per month. That's $3,400 leaving your pocket every month just to keep those two things. Now, most people would proudly call both of those assets. But here's the uncomfortable question. If something takes money out of your pocket every month, why do we call it an asset? Why do so many people believe they're building wealth when their biggest purchases are quietly draining their cash flow? And this single misunderstanding is one of the biggest reasons people stay stuck financially. Today, I'm going to show you the idea Robert Kiyosaki popularized that completely changes how you look at money, the difference between assets and liabilities. By the end of this video, you'll understand why two people earning the exact same salary can end up with completely different financial lives. One slowly builds wealth, while the other stays stuck despite making good money. We'll break down how wealthy people actually think about ownership, why income by itself doesn't create financial security, and the simple math behind assets that generate cash flow. And this matters more than ever right now. Lifestyle inflation keeps rising, debt levels keep climbing, and millions of people are unknowingly filling their lives with things that look like wealth, but quietly behave like liabilities. My name is John, and I spend way too much time thinking about how people build wealth and why so many smart people struggle financially. If you're someone who feels like you're working hard, earning more than you used to, but your financial progress still feels slower than it should, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now let's go back to that idea for a second. Assets versus liabilities, because this is where the entire conversation about wealth really starts. One of the reasons Rich Dad, Poor Dad became so widely discussed is because it introduced a very simple idea that challenged how most people think about money. Robert Kiyosaki defined wealth using a surprisingly straightforward rule. Assets put money in your pocket. Liabilities take money out of your pocket. That's it. At first, that sounds almost too simple, but the more you apply that lens to everyday financial decisions, the more revealing it becomes. Think about the things people are encouraged to buy throughout their lives. A bigger house, a nicer car, new furniture, the latest electronics. None of those things are necessarily bad purchases. The problem is that many of them require ongoing payments, maintenance, insurance, taxes, or depreciation. In other words, they create continuous outflows of money. From Kiyosaki's perspective, that means they behave like liabilities, even if society labels them as assets. And this is exactly why the idea was controversial. Traditional financial advice often focuses on things like income, budgeting, and saving. Those are important, but they don't always focus on a key question. Is the thing you're buying generating cash flow or consuming it? In many cases, people with good salaries are still struggling financially, not because they earn too little, but because most of what they own continuously pulls money out of their pocket. Meanwhile, wealthy individuals tend to focus on acquiring things that send money back to them. Rental income, dividends, business profits, royalties. Those are assets in the purest sense of the word. Here's what most people don't realize. The difference between financial stress and financial freedom often has less to do with how much you earn, and far more to do with what you own that pays you back. One of the most common traps people fall into is what you might call the asset illusion. It's the belief that simply owning expensive things means you're becoming wealthier. A bigger house, a newer car, upgraded appliances, the latest phone, watch, or technology. Individually, none of these purchases seem unreasonable. In fact, many of them are marketed as signs that you're progressing financially. You worked hard, your income increased, so naturally your lifestyle should improve too. But when you look at the numbers, a different story starts to appear. According to the Federal Reserve, the average new car payment in the United States is now over $730 per month, and many loans stretch out to 6 or even 7 years. Some buyers are paying $900 or more every month just to drive a vehicle that is steadily losing value. Now add insurance, maintenance, registration, and fuel. That one asset might actually be costing well over $1,000 a month in total. Housing tells a similar story. Mortgage payments have risen dramatically over the past few years, and many households are now spending 30% or more of their income on housing costs, which financial planners often consider the upper limit of affordability. So when someone buys a bigger home, they may feel like they've taken a step forward financially. After all, they now own more. But in reality, their monthly obligations may have just increased by another $1,000 or $1,500. And that's where the illusion comes in. Owning expensive things feels like wealth because they signal success. They look impressive from the outside. They make it appear as though someone is financially ahead. But if those things require constant payments to maintain them, they're not strengthening your financial position. They're increasing the pressure on your income. This is where people get this wrong. They measure wealth by what they can afford to buy, instead of by what they own that generates income. And that difference between looking wealthy and actually building wealth is one of the most important shifts in financial thinking. Here's the simple framework that sits at the center of this entire idea. You can test almost any financial decision with a single question. Does this put money into my pocket every month, or does it take money out? That's what we can call the cash flow test. If something consistently sends money into your bank account, it behaves like an asset. If it requires ongoing payments to maintain it, it behaves like a liability. Now, this doesn't mean liabilities are evil. Everyone needs a place to live, transportation, and things that make life enjoyable. But financially speaking, the difference becomes very clear when you look at cash flow. For example, imagine you own a small rental property that generates $500 per month after expenses. That doesn't sound dramatic at first, but let's do the math. $500 per month is $6,000 per year. And unlike a salary, that income isn't tied to hours worked. It continues coming in as long as the asset exists and is managed properly. The same concept applies to other types of assets. Dividend-paying stocks can distribute income every quarter. Businesses generate profits from customers. Royalties from books, music, or intellectual property can produce payments long after the work is finished. Each of these assets shares one common characteristic. They generate cash flow. Now watch what happens when you start stacking assets like this. One asset producing $500 per month becomes two assets producing $1,000 per month. Three assets become $1,500 per month. At some point, the conversation about money starts to change, because once assets begin producing meaningful income, your financial life becomes less dependent on your paycheck and more dependent on what you own that pays you back. One of the biggest misunderstandings about money is the belief that high income automatically leads to wealth. At first glance, that sounds logical. If someone earns a large salary, they should have an easier time building financial security. But when you look at the data, the relationship between income and wealth is not nearly as straightforward as people assume. For example, surveys from the Federal Reserve and other financial studies consistently show that a surprising number of high-income households still live paycheck to paycheck. Even among households earning well into six figures, a large percentage report that most of their income is already committed to expenses. And this is where the difference between earners and owners becomes important. An earner relies primarily on income from work. Their lifestyle is supported by a paycheck. An owner, on the other hand, relies increasingly on income from assets, things that generate money whether they are actively working or not. To see how this plays out, imagine a doctor earning $300,000 per year. That sounds like financial security, and in many ways, it is a strong income. But now consider the typical lifestyle that sometimes grows around that income. A large mortgage, 2 luxury car payments, private school tuition, high insurance costs, travel, and lifestyle upgrades. Each individual decision may feel reasonable, but together, they can absorb most of that income. So even with a high salary, the person may still feel financially constrained because the system they've built depends entirely on continued earnings from work. Meanwhile, someone earning far less may quietly accumulate assets that produce income over time: rental properties, dividend investments, small businesses, or other cash flow sources. Over the long run, the second person may develop more financial flexibility, not because they earned more money, but because they focused on owning things that produce income. Here's the dangerous assumption. Many people believe the path to wealth is simply earning more and upgrading your lifestyle along the way. But if every raise immediately turns into higher expenses, then higher income alone doesn't create financial freedom. Ownership does. Let's pause for a moment and run a simple thought experiment, because understanding this difference becomes much clearer when you look at what happens over time. Imagine two people who start their careers earning about the same salary. Over the years, both of them receive raises as their income grows, but they handle those raises very differently. Person A does what most people naturally do. As income increases, lifestyle increases along with it. A slightly nicer apartment, a newer car, more expensive vacations, more monthly subscriptions and upgrades. None of these decisions seem extreme. In fact, they feel like normal progress. But over time, most of the extra income simply turns into higher monthly expenses. Now look at person B. When their income increases, they allow themselves some improvements in lifestyle, but they also redirect part of every raise toward assets. Let's say they invest $500 per month into assets that grow or generate income. That's $6,000 per year. Now assume those investments grow at an average return of about 8 to 10% per year, which historically has been roughly the long-term average of the stock market. At first, the numbers look small. After the first year, you've only invested $6,000. But over time, something powerful starts happening: compounding. After 10 years of investing $500 per month at about 9%, the total value grows to roughly $95,000 to $100,000. After 20 years, that number grows to around $330,000 to $350,000. And after 30 years, the total can reach over $900,000. Now here's the part people often miss. The money itself is only part of the story. That portfolio can also begin generating income through dividends, interest, or other cash flow sources, meaning the assets themselves start producing money. Person A may have a higher lifestyle, but person B now owns something that pays them back every year. And this is where the conversation about money starts to shift, because once assets begin producing income, retirement stops being just a distant age on a calendar. This changes how you look at retirement. So if the math behind assets is so powerful, a natural question appears. Why don't more people focus on buying them? The answer has less to do with intelligence and more to do with psychology. Most financial decisions are not made on a spreadsheet. They're made in social environments. People naturally compare themselves to others. If friends upgrade their cars, move into larger homes, or start buying more expensive things, it creates an invisible pressure to keep up, not necessarily out of vanity, but out of a desire to feel like you're progressing in life. This is what economists sometimes call status signaling. Certain purchases send a message to the outside world that you're successful. A new car in the driveway is visible. A luxury apartment is visible. Expensive clothes or gadgets are visible. But an investment account growing quietly in the background is not. And because those signals are so powerful, many people end up prioritizing purchases that look successful today rather than ownership that produces income tomorrow. There's also the problem of instant gratification. Buying a new car delivers a reward immediately. You can see it, drive it, enjoy it. But buying a dividend fund or investing in a rental property often feels slow and abstract. The reward is delayed. A simple analogy helps explain this difference. Imagine two choices. One option is buying fruit every week at the store. You get the fruit immediately, but you have to keep paying for it over and over again. The other option is planting fruit trees. It takes time. At first you see very little reward, but eventually the trees begin producing fruit year after year. Assets behave like fruit trees. Liabilities behave like buying fruit every week. And this is the part nobody talks about. Building wealth often requires choosing the slower, less visible option today, so that your future self has something that keeps producing value long after the purchase is made. At this point, two common objections usually come up. The first one sounds like this. Now you might be thinking, a house is still an asset. And technically, that's true in an accounting sense. A home is something you own that may have value and could potentially be sold later. But Kiyosaki's argument was focused on cash flow, not just net worth on paper. If a house requires a monthly mortgage, property taxes, insurance, repairs, and maintenance, then from a monthly cash flow perspective, it behaves more like a liability. That doesn't mean buying a home is always a bad decision. Housing provides stability and long-term appreciation in many cases. The key distinction is simply understanding that your primary residence usually doesn't generate income while you live in it, so it shouldn't be confused with an investment that produces cash flow. The second objection is just as common. Now you might be thinking, you need money to buy assets. And yes, assets do require capital, but the mistake many people make is believing you need a large amount of money before you can start building ownership. In reality, many people begin much smaller, investing a few $100s per month in dividend funds, buying shares of businesses through index funds, saving toward a small rental property over time. The first asset often feels small and slow, but the goal isn't to become wealthy overnight. The goal is to begin building an asset base that gradually grows and starts producing income over the long run. Once assets begin producing income, something important starts happening. Your financial system begins to change. At first, most people rely entirely on earned income. You work, you receive a paycheck, and that paycheck supports your expenses. But when assets start producing even a small amount of cash flow, a second stream of income appears. And that's where the dynamic shifts. Imagine you start with assets producing $200 per month. That's not life-changing money, but it is money that arrives without additional hours worked. Now suppose instead of spending that $200, you reinvest it into more assets. Over time, that additional ownership might grow your monthly asset income to $400 per month. Then you reinvest that again. Eventually, it becomes $800 per month. And as the process continues, the system begins to accelerate, because now your assets are doing part of the work that your paycheck used to do alone. This is sometimes described as a wealth flywheel. At first, it moves slowly. You push, and the results feel almost invisible. But each additional asset adds a little more momentum. Income from assets buys more assets. Those assets produce even more income. And gradually the process becomes easier because the system is now helping you move forward. And this is where it gets really interesting. At a certain point, the question stops being, how many hours can I work? And starts becoming, how many assets can I own that produce income? So if this idea is true, that wealth grows from owning assets that produce income, the natural question becomes, what do you actually do with this information? Let's break this into a few practical steps. Step 1. Calculate your asset income number. This is simply the amount of monthly income your assets currently generate. For most people starting out, that number is 0, and that's okay. The goal isn't to feel discouraged. The goal is to become aware of where you're starting from, because once you know that number, you can begin focusing on growing it. Step 2. Track your monthly liabilities. Look at the things that require money every month: mortgage or rent, car payments, subscriptions, insurance, lifestyle spending. You don't necessarily need to eliminate all of these, but understanding how much cash flow leaves your life every month helps clarify the system you're operating in. This is where many people discover something surprising. Most of their financial energy goes toward maintaining liabilities rather than building assets. Step 3. Automate asset purchases. One of the easiest ways to build ownership is through consistency. Instead of trying to invest large amounts occasionally, many people automate smaller investments every month. For example, $200 or $500 automatically invested into assets like index funds or dividend-paying investments. Over time, that consistency builds ownership without requiring constant decisions. Step 4. Avoid lifestyle inflation. This is the step that quietly determines whether wealth grows or stalls. When income increases, it's tempting to immediately upgrade everything around you. But even redirecting a portion of every raise toward assets can dramatically change your long-term trajectory. And one optional step that can be surprisingly motivating: measure your cash flow growth. Track how much income your assets generate each year. Watching that number slowly rise, even from $0 to $50 per month, reinforces the idea that you're building something that eventually starts paying you back. Now imagine what this looks like years down the road. At first, asset income might be small. Maybe it's $100 a month, then $300, then $700. Nothing dramatic. But over time, if you consistently build and reinvest, those numbers start growing. Eventually, something interesting happens. Your assets begin producing enough income to cover one bill, maybe your phone bill, then your car payment. Later, maybe your rent or mortgage. And at some point, often after years of steady ownership, the income from what you own starts covering most of your living expenses. That's the moment the conversation about money changes. Because when your expenses are covered by asset income, your job stops being the thing that keeps your life running. Work becomes optional, not mandatory. You can still work if you want to. You can pursue projects you enjoy. You can take risks that might have felt impossible before. That's the core idea Kiyosaki was pointing to. Wealth isn't just about earning more money. It's about building a system where what you own eventually starts paying for the life you live. So here's a simple question for you. What's the first asset you're working toward right now? Maybe it's your first investment account. Maybe it's dividend stocks. Maybe it's saving toward a rental property or building a small business. Comment below and share what you're currently building. I'm curious to see what kinds of assets people are focusing on, and it's always interesting to see the different paths people take toward financial independence. My name is John, and I'm not a financial advisor. This video is for educational purposes only. Always do your own research and make financial decisions based on your individual situation.